Hello, and welcome to the sixth episode of the RCRM Speaker Series, Season 2. I am Dr. Georgiana Stanciu with the last episode before the summer break. The series will resume after this episode in September. Our speaker today is Bryan McClure, a Ph.D. candidate in the History Department at Western University in London, Ontario. Bryan has an undergraduate degree at Queen's University. Then he traveled overseas to complete his master's in philosophy in modern Irish history at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. After examining the nature of the First World War commemoration in Dublin, he returned to Canada to research personal memory and commemoration of the First World War in the British Empire. Bryan researched memorials to individuals across the Commonwealth, including the United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. His PhD dissertation is titled "He Gave His Life for the Empire: Memory, Memorials, and Identity in the British Empire After the Second World War." Initially managed by the Red Cross during the First World War, the burial of the dead became an official enterprise of the British Army in 1915. 2 years later, the organization was named the Imperial War Grave Commission, and from 1921 to 1931 managed to set up 2,400 cemeteries across France and Belgium. Thousands of families were affected by the tragedy of the First World War, of losing their own, and the depleted communities share the grief. For the sixth episode of the RCRM Speaker Series Season 2, Bryan will explore the history of the wooden battlefield crosses, grave markers placed at the burial sites, the debates over their replacement with headstones, and the decision that saw them shipped across the British Empire to next of kin or to units to which the individuals were affiliated. And our museum holds quite a few of such grave markers, collective or individual. So let's listen to Bryan.
Hello, and welcome to my talk today entitled Between the Crosses, Row on Row, Battlefield Crosses as Sites of Mourning and Memory. My name is Bryan McClure. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of Western Ontario. Before I start today, I would like to thank the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum for hosting the second season of this speaker series. The talks have been very engaging so far, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to share with you some of my research. The story of the writing of In Flanders Fields by Dr. John McCrae is one that many Canadians are well versed in. Written on May 3, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, McCrae was inspired to write the poem after burying his friend, Major Alexis Helmer, in Essex Farm Cemetery the previous day. The setting of the cemetery, with the red poppies growing out of the ruined land and the new graves, inspired the opening lines of the poem, quote, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below." The opening stanza of the poem firmly places the audience in the setting of a battlefield cemetery. However, a visit to the Ypres battlefields today would not show visitors the same setting of McCrae's poem. Beyond the repairs to the land that have happened over the past century, visitors to the battlefield cemeteries would fail to see the poppies blow between the crosses row on row. Instead, the battlefield cemeteries are filled with headstones, marking the burial place of many First World War soldiers, including McCrae himself. So what happened to the crosses that helped inspire McCrae to write In Flanders Fields? And how did the headstones end up in their place? Today, I want to take you through that history and understand the use of battlefield crosses during the war through to their uses today. Rather than simply being replaced by stones, I want to show you how these battlefield crosses became markers of commemoration and remembrance for the next of kin once the headstones were installed. These crosses represent a vital means of remembrance for the next of kin of the war dead, as they use them to create memorials, remember their loved ones, and substitute the graves for those who were buried overseas. As time passed, these crosses found new meaning as they entered into museums, churches, and private possession, where they now serve as reminders to the next generation of the losses and memory of the First World War. We will examine a number of battlefield crosses and explore their history by examining how the families used the crosses and where the crosses have been displayed in the 100 years since the end of the First World War. Along the way, we will examine why the crosses were replaced with headstones and the controversies surrounding such a decision, as well as the decision to send them to the next of kin when they were replaced. We will also see how the meaning of these crosses has changed over time as successive generations have interacted with them, revealing the way that society's memories of an historical event are always shifting and adapting to the present-day conditions. The case studies presented today will feature Canadians, including several in London, but also battlefield crosses located in Britain, Ireland, and New Zealand to show how these battlefield crosses ended up around the world. The concern over the marking and maintenance of the war graves became an issue early in the war. The founder of the Imperial War Graves Commission, Sir Fabian Ware, started down the path of maintaining war graves in 1914 when he was an ambulance driver for the Red Cross. He headed a small group of ambulance drivers from Britain, and as he drove wounded soldiers to hospitals and traveled with the British Expeditionary Force during the fighting, he kept noticing the battlefield crosses springing up. The fabrication of these crosses was very haphazard and relied on the soldiers to create them using any spare wood they could find after burying their comrades. Ware began trying to ensure there was a record of them by recording the details and their locations and ordered his ambulance teams to do the same thing. In October 1914, he was able to convince the Red Cross to create a separate division that would record and try to maintain war graves that he would lead. It was after a visit to Bethune Town Cemetery in France that the medical assessor of the Red Cross authorized the creation of the Graves Unit. In 1915, the British Army would create an official body to record and maintain the graves, called the Directorate of Graves Registration Unit, with Ware promoted to its head. The Directorate attempted to create a unified standard to the battlefield crosses, but beyond those buried behind the lines in military hospitals or field dressing stations, the Directorate had trouble ensuring the crosses had all the identifying markers. The Army did not put significant resources into creating the crosses or to the Directorate, as Ware operated throughout the war with as few personnel as possible. Nonetheless, the Directorate had mass-produced crosses created from cheap wood soaked in varnish to protect them from the weather, and developed an easy way of marking them. Rather than painting on the names, they took thin sheets of metal and punched the details of the individual onto it. They limited the information to name, rank, unit, and date of death with an identification number that corresponded to their registers. It was in the registers that they had the full information on the individual. A further difficulty the Directorate had was the shifting lines of battle that made older graves lost in the fighting. Alexis Helmer serves as an example of this, as his body, buried in 1915, was lost as the continued fighting around Ypres saw the cemetery destroyed. While his battlefield cross was found after the war, his body was never identified, and as such Helmer is commemorated on the Meningate Memorial rather than in a cemetery. The Imperial War Graves Commission, founded in 1917, which followed the Directorate and was also headed by Sir Fabian Ware, had the monumental task of organizing and beautifying the cemeteries. Ware recruited several leading architectural and artistic advisors to aid in the development of cemetery design. While the commission approved of the look of the crosses, the decision was made instead to create headstones to permanently mark the graves. The decision was taken for two reasons. First, the headstones offered more space to record all the information the commission wanted, which included the soldier's name, rank, date of death, age, unit, a small epitaph written by the next of kin, a religious symbol, and a carving of their unit's badge. The second reason for selecting headstones was due to religious issues of non-Christian soldiers who died, an issue first raised during the Imperial War Conference of 1917. Two representatives from India, Ganga Singh, the Maharaja of Bikaner, and Satyendra Sinha wrote to the Commission voicing their concerns about the use of crosses along with the general treatment of Indian war graves. The need to address the religious needs of Hindu and Muslim soldiers who died in the war meant the Commission could not mandate crosses as the permanent markers. Allowing for religious symbols to be carved on the headstones meant others could be commemorated and not ruin the unified effect of the cemeteries. Commission advisor Sir Frederick Kenyon believed that the headstones would create a strong aesthetic, giving, quote, the appearance as of a battalion on parade and suggesting the spirit of discipline and order, which is the soul of an army, end quote. The decision to use a headstone over a cross did not come without controversy. In 1919, the Prince of Wales, as the president of the Commission, received a lengthy petition organized by Lady Florence Cecil. Lady Cecil, the wife of the Bishop of Exeter and sister-in-law to the Earl of Salisbury, had lost 3 of her 4 sons in the war and was not happy with the Commission. She disagreed firstly with the decision to not repatriate bodies, then with the policy that families could not choose their own memorial, and finally that the headstone had been selected over a cross. Lady Cecil, in her petition, expressed her position by stating, quote, we have been deeply wounded by the decision of the Commission that no crosses, other than those engraved on the headstones, which time and the weather will soon deface, are to be erected over the individual graves of those who gave their lives to preserve the lives and liberty of others. It was through the strength of the cross that many of them were enabled to do so. It is only through the hope of the cross that most of us are able to carry on the life from which all the sunshine seems to have gone, and to deny us the emblem of that strength and hope adds heavily to the burden of our sorrow. End quote. Lady Cecil's petition revealed a large number of individuals who supported her, as it was 364 pages long. The Commission needed to find a way to appease these demands from Lady Cecil and her supporters. Kenyon opened a dialogue with Cecil and one of her supporters in the British Parliament, Lord Balfour, by agreeing to view their demands for an alternative to the headstone. Balfour had a mock-up of what he and Lady Cecil believed the cross should look like, and in 1920 the 2 designs were shown to MPs before a debate on the Imperial War Graves Commission. The Commission argued that the designs for a cross were ugly, crowded, and insensitive to Imperial soldiers who were not Christian. The majority of MPs agreed with the Commission, and they voted down the proposals of Cecil and Balfour, ending the debate of headstones versus crosses. Instead, in an attempt to accommodate the concerns of people like Lady Cecil, the Commission decided to provide families with the battlefield crosses that were over the graves of their loved ones. The Commission had originally intended to destroy the crosses as they had viewed them as temporary placeholders. The decision to provide the families with the wooden crosses helped to give them a connection to the graves and was a way for them to feel connected to the final resting place of their family member. The Commission sent out messages to major newspapers in Britain and had the High Commissioners of each Dominion replicate the message in their newspapers, alerting next of kin to apply for the battlefield crosses. The Canadian government, however, had some reservations about the policy, believing it was not a fair one. The issue the Canadian government raised was the fact that many bodies were missing and as such had no cross, creating unequal treatment for the next of kin who would apply for a cross but not receive one. Along with this, the government feared that due to the time it would take to build the cemeteries, citizens would become impatient and angry at not receiving the cross fast enough. The government believed that the whole policy should be abandoned, but only if the rest of the imperial governments agreed. The Canadian government's plan was supported by the Australian and New Zealand governments, who also expressed opposition to returning the crosses. The Dominions were overruled, though, as a large number of requests had come in from Britain, meaning those who had asked for crosses in the dominions had to have them supplied to them as well, even if their requests had been significantly lower than those received by Britain. In June 1921, after the deadline for requests for the crosses had passed, the Commission reported only receiving 1,343 applications from Canada for battlefield crosses. Once the crosses returned home, their uses varied depending on the family and the means by which they would remember their loved ones. The rest of this talk will explore a selection of different battlefield crosses and examine how they have been used and are currently used to commemorate both the war and the individual they represent. Many crosses have found themselves moved multiple times, from being placed in private quarters and only used by the family to being put on public display. The use of the crosses shifts as they are placed in different contexts, locations, and used by people other than the next of kin. A large number of battlefield crosses were erected in churches by the families. Here, these crosses became part of the church fabric, serving as a memorial to the fallen soldier as well as contributing to the larger commemorative practices of the church. The erection of crosses in churches were done with the desire to both create a sentimental memorial to their loved one and to help place them in their community. The placement of battlefield crosses in churches helped to add to the fabric of the church, giving them a prominent place of remembrance in a place that was important for their family. The placement of crosses in churches not only helped to cement the memory of the soldier as part of the remembrance of the war, but also served as a secondary burial place, a location for mourning to take place as it could not be done at the actual gravesite. The use of these battlefield crosses, items that once served as the grave marker, created a tangible connection to the actual grave of the soldier, giving families the ability to mourn at their grave even though they were thousands of kilometers away. Here in London, Ontario, some crosses can be seen in St. Paul's Cathedral, where the battlefield cross of Lieutenant Lionel Hyman Elliot is on display. Lionel was born in London, but had moved out of the city to Goderich when his father William became the manager of the Bank of Montreal there. Lionel was living in Hamilton as a clerk in the Bank of Montreal when he enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in the 75th Battalion and went overseas in 1916. He was killed on April 9, 1917, during the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and he was buried in Canadian Cemetery No. 2 in Neuville-Saint-Vaast in France. The Elliot family moved quickly to commemorate Lionel. They erected a stained glass window to him in St. George's Anglican Church in Goderich, betraying the St. George in medieval knight's armor. The window was installed on June 18, 1918. The family, though, had moved out of Goderich as the father William had been transferred to London to be the manager of the bank branch there. They had returned to Goderich for the unveiling of the window, and it remains in the church to this day. When the battlefield cross that was originally over Lionel's grave was sent to the family, they were living in London, and so they had it erected in St. Paul's Cathedral. The cross had been created shortly after the battle and was hand-painted with stencils. The family had a small plaque installed under the cross that reads, quote, "At Vimy, France. Whoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. St. Luke 17:33." End quote. The location of the cross in the cathedral, surrounded by other memorials to war, influences how the cross is interpreted today. Hanging in the cathedral are the colors of several Canadian military units. Some of them, which are hanging very close to where Lionel's cross is, include 3 CEF battalions of the 18th, the 33rd, and the 142nd. Lionel is also not the only individual with a memorial in the cathedral who died in the First World War. Plaques were erected to Frederick Courtney Raymond, Victor John Kent, and the brothers Henry Campbell and Archibald Valancy Beecher. Alongside Lionel, a second battlefield cross belonging to John Labatt Scatcherd is also in the cathedral. John was a member of the Labatt Bryan family. His mother was Catherine Labatt, and his grandfather was John Labatt II. He joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1916 and was commissioned after a course in Kingston, Ontario, into the Canadian Field Artillery. He was killed during the fighting of the last 100 days on September 3, 1918, while serving as a scout for his artillery unit. He was buried in Ville-en-Artois Cemetery in France. His mother remained in London and served on the board of the Labatt Brewing Company. John's battlefield cross was sent to his mother in 1925, and she placed it in St. Paul's Cathedral, which the Labatt family had been highly active members of. A plaque was placed under the cross reading, quote, "In loving memory of Lieutenant John Labatt Scatcherd, M.C., killed in action September 4, 1918. This cross was erected at Ville-en-Artois, France, by the officers and men of the 11th Battery Canadian Field Artillery, sent to Canada in 1925." End quote. The discrepancy in his date of death is due to confusion as to when he died, as he was last heard from on the 3rd, and his body was not found until the 4th. The erection of the Elliot and Scatcherd crosses in St. Paul's was due to the close and important connection each of them had to the church itself. Lionel was baptized in St. Paul's, and John had been a worshipper in the church until his enlistment. The crosses then were placed in the churches due to the sentimental value the location had to each of the men. Today, the crosses contribute as symbols of the community's service in military conflicts, showcasing the sacrifice of members alongside the honorable service seen in the regimental colors on display. The placement of crosses in churches were repeated across the British Empire. While the crosses of Scatcherd and Elliot follow the standard formula of simple wooden crosses, some were more distinct in their design and placement. An example of this can be seen in the battlefield cross to Captain Alwyn Travers Lloyd. Alwyn was a pilot flying for the 32nd Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps and was killed during a patrol over Ypres in the Battle of Passchendaele on September 28, 1917. He was buried in Lisenhoek Military Cemetery in Belgium by his squadron mates. Following the tradition set up by the RFC, Alwyn was marked by his comrades with the prop of a propeller. Using a four-bladed prop, 3 of the blades were cut short to create a cross, and in the middle the name was written. These unique battlefield crosses were replaced by the Imperial War Graves Commission and sent to the next of kin. Alwyn's propeller cross was erected by his parents in St. Lawrence's Church in the town of Hawkhurst in Kent, England. Alwyn has links to Canada, as his mother, Rebecca Olive Lloyd, née Travers, was born in Brockville, Ontario, and his grandfather was the Archbishop of Ontario for the Anglican Church, John Travers Lewis. The link to Canada was highlighted by his mother in the plaque erected next to the propeller that reads, quote, "In proud and ever-loving memory of Captain Alwyn Travers Lloyd, the Buffs, East Kent Regiment, and Royal Flying Corps, youngest son of Llewellyn F. Lloyd of Lilsden, Hawkhurst, and grandson of John Travers Lewis, Archbishop of Ontario, Canada. He gave his life flying over the enemy's lines near Ypres, September 28, 1917, aged 23. The above propeller cross was brought from his grave in the military cemetery." End quote. Alwyn's propeller cross placement in St. Lawrence's Church was done to give his parents a place to mourn his death, as they were members of the congregation. In St. John's Church in the town of Kapongwa in New Zealand, the parish memorial is flanked by 2 battlefield crosses. One cross is dedicated to William Alexander Ford, killed in the Battle of the Somme on September 25, 1916, while the other is dedicated to 2 brothers, William Thomas and Henry James Fall. The cross to the Fall brothers is unique, as only one of the 2 brothers has a known grave. William Thomas, the older of the 2 brothers, born in 1893, was killed on October 17, 1917, in the Battle of Passchendaele, and his body was lost, resulting in him being named on the Tyncott Memorial to the Missing. Henry James, born in 1894, was killed a year earlier on September 26, 1916, due to wounds he sustained during the Battle of the Somme. He was buried by the Imperial War Graves Commission in AIF's burial ground in Flers, France. When Henry's cross was returned to his mother, Elizabeth Ann Forman, she added metal markers naming William so that he was included in the memorial. The falls are an important example to highlight due to their position in society as they were members of the working class. William was working as a factory assistant and Henry was a cheesemaker before enlisting. While most of the crosses that have survived were for those in the middle or upper classes, the falls display that everyone did and could request the crosses. The cross gave their mother the opportunity to mourn both her sons lost in the war, even if she had no physical item of William's burial. The placement of the cross today is less about mourning and rather a support to the church roll of honor, as it acts as one of the two physical symbols of the community's service in the war. Battlefield crosses have also served in much larger memorials. In New Zealand, the Eskdale War Memorial Church was built in honor of Percival Moore Beattie. Percival was born in New Zealand and was living in the Eskdale area as a sheep farmer before the war began. He served as a captain in the 3rd New Zealand Rifle Brigade and was killed near the end of the war on November 4, 1918, and is buried in Crossroads Cemetery in Fontaine-du-Bois, France. Shortly after his death, his wife Annie Henrietta Beattie and his father-in-law Thomas Clark began working on building the church, which was completed and dedicated on December 3, 1920. A plaque in the church foyer identifies the building as a memorial to Percival. After the return of Percival's battlefield cross, it was also placed in the foyer along with his military medals and the commemorative medallion better known as a dead man's penny. The builders of the church, Thomas and Annie, both worshipped here until they passed away, with Thomas dying in 1922 and Annie in 1978. The Eskdale Church, though, also plays a larger role in community commemoration. Upon its construction, a plaque was unveiled next to the door into the main body of the church, listing the men of the area who died in the war. The top of the plaque again reinforces the function of the church as being a memorial to Percival, before listing 26 other men who died in the conflict. Flanking the plaque is the British Union Jack and the New Zealand national flag. The church came to play a larger role in commemoration when in 1926 the French government gifted the church a regimental flag as a symbol of thanks and remembrance for New Zealanders who fought and died in France. In 1947, a second plaque was unveiled on the opposite side of the door to commemorate locals who died in the Second World War. The memorial also includes the names of former residents of an orphanage and boarding house in the town called France House. A total of 12 names are on the Second World War memorial. A battlefield cross was also included in one of the most elaborate memorials to a single individual killed in the war, helping to show the feeling of loss. This memorial, located in St. Andrew's Church in the town of Mells in England, is dedicated to Edward William Horner, a lieutenant in the 18th Queen Mary's Own Hussars. The Horner family was a minor noble family, but had extensive connections to powerful members of British social and political elites. One of Edward's best friends and his brother-in-law was Raymond Asquith, the only son of the Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, who was the leader of Britain at the start of the war. Both Edward and Raymond were killed in the war, and while both have memorials dedicated to them in St. Andrew's Church, it is Edward's that stands out. The memorial features a life-size bronze sculpture of Edward in uniform on horseback on top of a plinth of Portland stone that features on the front the Horner coat of arms, and on the sides inscriptions about Edward, and on the back the battlefield cross. The memorial is well known for its artistic qualities and caliber, as it was created by famous architect Sir Edwin Lutyens. Lutyens made his name before the war as one of the chief architects of the new capital of India, the city of New Delhi. He would become well known for his work after the war with the Imperial War Graves Commission as one of the principal architects of the cemeteries. He designed a number of famous war memorials, including the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Battle of the Somme, the Irish National War Memorial Gardens in Dublin, the India Gate in New Delhi, and the Cenotaph in London, England. The Cenotaph is perhaps the most duplicated memorial to the First World War, as it was copied across the British Empire, including here in London, Ontario. While Lutens designed the memorial, he hired Sir Alfred Munnings to do the sculpture of Edward on horseback. The inclusion of the cross on the memorial was a deliberate act, as the plinth was designed to have the cross inserted into it. The erection of the memorial in 1920 was before most of the cemeteries in France and Belgium were complete. Lutens therefore designed the memorial to have the carved rear waiting for the cross to be returned and set into the memorial once the permanent headstone was erected. The inclusion of the cross helps the memorial move from being grandiose to personal, as the wood stands out with its weathering, chips, and painted features in juxtaposition to the bronze and stone that dominates the memorial. The cross represents the humanity of Edward in comparison to the larger-than-life nature of the statue. The wooden cross reminds us that the elaborate memorials only hide the sorrow of loss. The statue will ensure Edward is remembered for a long time, and the cross is the reminder that he was once human. Along with crosses being placed in churches to create memorials to loved ones, others were placed outside in cemeteries. These crosses marked the place where families would have buried their loved ones had they been able to repatriate their bodies. Placed in family plots or crypts, these crosses physically replaced the bodies by serving as the new bodies in the cemeteries. The importance of families being mourned together can be seen in the placement of crosses in family plots. One of the most well-known English sporting casualties of the war, Ronald William Poulton Palmer, was remembered by his family by having his battlefield cross placed in Holywell Cemetery in Oxford. Ronnie, as he was known as, was captain of the England national rugby team before the war. He was killed in the Second Battle of Ypres on May 5, 1915, while serving as a lieutenant with the Royal Berkshire Regiment. He was buried in Hyde Corner Royal Berks Cemetery by the Imperial War Graves Commission. The cross was sent back to his father, a professor of zoology at Oxford University, and was placed in Holywell Cemetery. The cross was placed next to the grave of Ronnie's youngest sister, Janet Mary Poulton Simmons, who had died in 1919. Ronnie's cross was inserted into the cemetery wall, and a plaque was added marking where Ronnie was actually buried. Over time, the plaque faded with weather and had a new round plaque added to keep the message alive. Ronnie's older brother, Dr. Edward, and his mother, Emily, were buried in Holywell in 1939, and his father, Sir Edward, was buried with them in 1943. Famously, Ronnie's final words were, quote, "I shall never play at Twickenham again," end quote. Twickenham is the home stadium of English rugby in London, England. While he most likely never said these words, the Rugby Football Union took them to heart and in 2018 decided to honor Ronnie by memorializing him in Twickenham Stadium. Seeking to bring part of Ronnie to the stadium, they took dirt from Twickenham's field to his grave and scattered it over him. They then took dirt from Ronnie's grave and buried it in the pitch in the players' tunnel. The exchange of soil replicated the function of the battlefield cross that saw a piece of the individual returned home and served as a marker of remembrance for the family, and in this case, for English rugby. The family of Scottish airman John Ross Robertson did the same thing as the Poulton family by placing his cross in Dunfermline Cemetery. Born and raised in the town of Dunfermline, John joined the Fife and Forfarshire Yeomanry and fought in the Gallipoli campaign. He returned to Scotland and transferred to the Royal Flying Corps in December 1916, where he learned to fly at the Montrose Air Station. He joined the 66th Squadron in France, and during a patrol over German lines, he was shot down on May 12, 1917. His body was recovered by German forces who buried him with military honors in Marquion German Cemetery, and erected a battlefield cross to him inscribed, quote, Ers tarb den Holdentod ein Engelflieger aufs 12,517, end quote, which translates to, He died the hero, an English flying officer, May 12, 1917. After the war, the cemetery John was buried in was concentrated as the German graves in the area were moved to a larger cemetery, and John's body was moved to Quarry Cemetery in the town of Marquion, which was set up by the Canadian troops of the 1st Division in September 1918. When John's permanent headstone was erected, the family chose to place the battlefield cross in the ground in front of the family memorial, laying it in the ground where John would have been buried. The Robertson family memorial was erected after the death of John's father, Sir William Robertson, in 1923, and also names John's mother, Elizabeth, who would die in 1932, along with his sister Mary, who died in 1967, and his sister-in-law, Esna, who died in 1965. The cross, though, is not the original cross and is in fact a copy. Made using harder wood, the family replicated the original cross to ensure that the one placed in the cemetery would survive exposure and the elements. The replica cross, though, was a very faithful replication of the original, ensuring the painted German text was the same, as well as the grave's registration unit markers added after the war. The cross in the cemetery is an exact replica down to the battle damage on the wood. So what happened to the original? It remained in the family's hands until 2009 when the Robertson family donated it to the Montrose Air Station Heritage Center. The airfield had remained in use until 1952 by the British Air Force, and local activists and historians worked to reopen it as a museum, which started in 1992. To help mark the centenary of the First World War, they embarked on a new memorial by building a new hangar that would house a full-size replica of a BE-2A and Sopwith Camel biplanes from the war. The new building was named the Lieutenant John Ross Robertson Building, and inside the battlefield cross was put on display. Here in the museum, the battlefield cross represents a memorial to all the pilots who flew at Montrose and died overseas. The cross spent decades in the family's possession, and it appears to have suffered from neglect, as the paint has all but faded away and damage to the wood from bugs is evident. The cross survives now because it is in the museum, but it clearly faded from memory and was forgotten for some time. Crosses have also experienced long journeys across the Atlantic Ocean several times. The battlefield cross to Joshua Strong, a corporal who served with the 29th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, is an example of the movement of crosses. Joshua was born in Westmoreland, England in 1889, and he was a miner working in slate quarries in northern England. In 1911, Joshua, with his younger sister Ada and their parents Joseph and Mary, immigrated to Canada, where they settled in Winnipeg. Joshua enlisted in December 1914 with the CEF, and he was killed in action in the final year of the war on April 26, 1918. He is buried in Bellecour Military Cemetery in Rivière, France. Upon the war's end, his battlefield cross, along with his personal effects, were sent to his family in Winnipeg. The Strong family did not remain in Canada, though, and in 1928 they boarded a ship returning to Westmoreland. The family eventually settled in southern Scotland, in the town of Gretna, where his father Joseph died in 1930 and his mother Mary in 1940. Joshua's parents brought with them from Canada the battlefield cross and other memorabilia from the war Joshua had sent them. After the death of her parents, Ada Strong came into possession of her brother's memorials and memorabilia. She kept them until 1983, when at the age of 90, she donated them to the Imperial War Museum in London, England. The J. Strong collection consists of letters and postcards Joshua sent home during his time in the Army, along with the telegrams marking his death. The dead man's penny sent to the family was included, as were two personal items in Joshua's watch and his wallet. The battlefield cross that the family received was also included in the collection. Ada would pass away several years after the donation in 1986. When the Imperial War Museum undertook a revitalization of their permanent gallery to the First World War for the centenary, thousands of objects in their collection were put on display for guests to witness. As part of their display on death and commemoration during the war, the battlefield cross of Joshua Strong was selected to represent all the battlefield crosses created. Joshua's battlefield cross has spent most of its 100-year life in the private care of the Strong family, serving as a reminder of the war with his other items that were saved. The cross traveled across the Atlantic twice and was placed into the hands of the largest military museum in Britain. Now, millions of people have and will continue to walk past the cross created to mark Joshua's burial place. Its placement in the Imperial War Museum has altered how Joshua is remembered. His memory, once held dear and close to the family, is now open for the world and visitors to experience. Yet the story of the cross is lost in the display. The power the cross had for his family to take it with them when they returned to Britain in 1928 reveals the importance it had for them in holding his memory dear. Now placed inside a display case, serving as an example for how the war was experienced, the emotive power of the cross has been washed down by the museum setting that it finds itself in, as the family memorial is no longer marking a family's sorrow. While the crosses I have showcased are only the tip of what is out there, most of the battlefield crosses did not survive the war. The battlefield crosses that were never sent back to the next of kin were destroyed by the Imperial War Graves Commission, who were unable to store them. Few of the crosses, though, have appeared on the open market, and finding a real battlefield cross for sale is exceedingly rare. Those that have survived the last 100 years can either be found in churches, cemeteries, museums, or still in the possession of the families, handed down to the next generation. This talk has hopefully shown you the value of battlefield crosses to further remembrance and commemoration of the First World War. The use of these crosses in future commemoration of the war should be considered carefully. While they can be lumped in with other memorials that showcase the losses of the war, I've tried to show that the crosses reveal the personal stories behind the war dead. The stories of these individuals reveals the dynamics of both the war and how those who were bereaved try to remember their loved ones. Away from community memorials, these battlefield crosses show us that individuals struggled with the loss of sons, fathers, husbands, and brothers that stone cenotaphs and community rules of honor could not fully address. Using these crosses to explore the individual losses of the conflict can allow society to create an emotional attachment to the dead and ensure that sorrow remains a guiding principle in our commemoration. It was sorrow, after all, that motivated John McCrae to write In Flanders Fields when he saw the poppies blowing between the crosses, row on row. Thank you for listening to my talk. If you have any questions about anything I have discussed today, please feel free to contact me via email, which you can find on the slide currently. Thank you once again to the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum for hosting these talks and for allowing me to share some of my research with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan, for sharing the results of your research. It is very interesting to follow the transformations around these grave markers that a century after their creation have become a medium to inform the public about the First World War. And thank you everyone for watching. Stay tuned for the podcast episode that will be released on 8th July. The series will resume on 23rd September with Mike Baker, Elgin County Museum Curator. Have a nice summer.